Welcome to everyone. I know some of you have been attending these classes regularly since March 30th, and some of you are just joining us, and we've got several folks from not only here in Tennessee, but throughout, well, many different states. I was getting ready to say the South, but we got some folks from Maryland and New York with us tonight too. So just take a few minutes, if you will, to make sure you know where your chat box is. Go ahead and mute your microphone just so we can reduce the feedback. I am recording, so this will end up on YouTube sometime in the next few days. And again, if you are attending for the first time tonight, you'll get an email link or an email with a link to a Google Drive that will have this presentation and the notes that go along with it, along with some additional resources that you can refer to later.
Microphone up.
Okay, wait a minute. I'm going to go in here and make sure we got everybody muted. Okay, I think we do. All right, so anyway, as you have questions, just throw them up in the chat box. Like I say, we'll get those answered in the next few days. And we're glad you're here. So we're going to get down to the nitty gritty about composting, maybe, if I can get my screen to advance. There we go. And composting, you know, especially maybe this year with all of us being at home during the pandemic, maybe we're starting to get a little bit more interested or trying to get more proficient in honing our skills for recycling our own food waste. And, you know, probably before this year, there's several of the master gardeners here in the county I know that have been composting, and myself included, but often we will hear folks be like, well, that's just going to be a nightmare if I try to do this at home. How do I go about doing it? It's just too complicated. It smells bad. It's too messy. It's not the fun side of gardening. But those are true statements if you're not composting the right way. So hopefully tonight you're going to get some tips on how to go about recycling some of those, because when we start composting at home, we're really helping to build our soil health. And those of you that know me know that I love to talk about soil. It's one of my favorite things in the universe. So I'll try to stay off of that as much as possible tonight, and we'll save that for another class. But when we do compost and we get good compost, then we're actually going to be providing that soil with a wealth of nutrition. It's going to provide bacteria and other microorganisms and worms essential food that they need to be able to, create more nutrition for wherever we're utilizing that compost. So we're basically going to help increase aeration because we're inviting some of those earthworms in to feed and provide worm castings. So lots of benefits that we're going to gain when we start doing some home composting. What is composting? That's just basically the biological decomposition of organic matter by a managed process. So maybe some of us have even composted in the past and maybe not even realized that we were composting. If we've just gone out and chunked scraps into a corner of the yard across the fence. My grandmother used to tell me that she'd peel potatoes and stuff. She had a compost bin, but if we get busy, cooking for Sunday lunch or something, or for church, you'd just say, go toss those across the fence. And so eventually over time, because I would be chunking those scraps in the same place, I'd have this little compost pile. I was too young to really know what that was at that time, but what I'm saying is several of us have probably done that, not even realized that we've done that. So it is just a managed process. We're breaking down waste by those microorganisms, and it's just a way of mirroring nature's way of recycling plant and animal waste, basically. Before we get too deep into this, there's two different processes. There's actually a cold process and a hot composting process. So cold composting is basically where you're going to start in the kitchen with all those food scraps that we've been talking about, or even coffee grounds. And if you can even utilize those coffee filters, not the Keurig pods, but if you're still making coffee the old-fashioned way, you can also add those filters to your compost. But eggshells, any of those type things are going to be what we refer to as that cold composting. Pretty simple, just placing those in a bin or a pile. And if you don't do anything else with that, in about a year, that's going to break down and decompose on its own. But we want to take that a little bit further tonight for tonight's talk, and we're going to talk about that actual cycle. So as we gather those materials, actually creating a compost pile or bin outside that we can continually use, reuse, feed, and it just be a cycle just like it is in nature. So you can see how that's basically going to work. We're going to take that waste, we're going to add air, we're going to start the breaking down process. That's going to heat up because these little critters are going to help heat that pile up. Basically, we're going to turn that into nature's fertilizer. We're going to plant. We start that whole cycle all over again. And this is just another schematic to kind of show how that works. To be sure that compost is going to be available for your spring planting, you want to start a pile in the fall, at least when you're cleaning up your garden and putting it to bed for winter, as I like to call it. But be aware that that compost pile is going to be like all your other plants. It's going to go dormant during the winter, but then it's going to start decomposing again come spring as those temperatures start rising 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So many folks will actually start another compost pile in the spring for fall planting if you're doing that. So again, it's going to be one of those things, depending on what setup you start with, that you can just continually be adding to those compost piles. And we're going to talk about a few of these. I'm not going to go into detail on how to build each one of these tonight, but I'm giving you some resources that will show you some of these ideas, how you can incorporate these. Pretty much anything you want to turn into a compost pile, you can do that with. Utilizing some of these old plastic barrels. This is an old plastic trash can. This is one like I put out on my curb every week, but then just gone back and put air holes, and you'll see why that's going to be important here in a few minutes. This is also an older mechanism, I guess, of composting, the trench composting, where you just have that, I don't know if you can tell that that's a trench, but then just adding those wastes to the piles. We can also recycle other gardening items like pallets, old wooden slats, again, any kind of plastic item that we can ventilate, even using your own garden, or maybe in a raised bed that you're kind of letting go fallow, or a portion of your garden through the winter time. If you have old lattice, any kind of wire frame bin that you can create, slatted bins, tiered bins, like I say, the list goes on. So hopefully you'll get some ideas from that this evening and put one of these to use in your own garden and landscape. So this, of course, is a picture of a landfill, and just to give you some stats there, our U.S. solid waste system comprises about 20% of yard and garden waste and 9% food waste. Well, that's about 30% that we could be taking out of landfills and actually having our own little landfill in our backyard, but we're actually putting that to a better use, because we're not going to be able to reuse that once it's in that landfill and it's taking up valuable space. So we're just creating our own soil and our own recycling is what we're doing there. So as we move through, you're going to see lots of different pictures, like I say, of some of these different composting mechanisms. And I guess before we go any further, it's not to say that one way is right and another way is wrong, because it's going to depend on your situation. There's going to be a few things that we want to do and things we don't want to do as a collective whole, but overall, how you create your compost bin is going to be specific to your needs. So the big thing is just making sure we have a mixture of these organic materials, and we want to make sure that they're piled like you see here in a big heap, whether we're containing that or it's just in a large area like this. We want to make sure that we're watering. I wouldn't have a water hose on it, but I wanted this picture to show you the importance of making sure we keep that composted material damp or a little bit moist. And again, eventually this is going to decompose into usable material in the garden. Now, for those in East Tennessee, we know this soil here well. Many of us deal with this on a daily basis, and it's something, this red clay, heavy clay soil is going to take a little while to help build that soil structure and that tilth. It almost gets a bricky, slaty looking structure and texture to it, and roots are not going to be easily penetrable through a soil like this. So when we start creating our own compost, we're basically adding a soil conditioner and helping improve that soil structure over time. And you can kind of see how that's going to look over time. So as we're incorporating, again, whether we're tilling that in, forking it in, using it in raised beds, even in the spring as we're doing germination with our seedlings, that's going to provide a great source of nutrition for our garden beds. And again, as you can see, as that compost breaks down, it's going to help bind with that really heavy clay soil. And that's just going to help us loosen it. It's going to make earthworms happy, and it's going to make nutrition and water more available to our plants. So when we're mixing that compost with sandy soil, the soil is going to be allowed to hold more water. If you're, live in an area where it's predominantly sand, we know water's just going to run right through, and nutrients and water is going to leach out pretty quickly. So compost is going to help with that because it's going to increase that soil structure. And over time, that's also going to increase that water holding and nutrient holding capacity for plants. And you see the earthworms there. We want to invite those critters in because, again, they're going to provide aeration, the worm casting, which is known as vermicomposting. That's going to be left in that soil, which is a high ratio or a high percentage of nitrogen, which we're going to need to help break down some of these other materials as we progress along through our composting. Once compost is complete, again, you can use that as a fertilizer. You can utilize that to incorporate into the soil, utilize that as a mulch, many different ways that you can use it. If you're using it as a mulch, of course, it's going to help reduce erosion. It's going to help buffer that soil surface temperature or from extremes, whether we get into a droughty summer in late August, September. It's going to help maintain that soil temp, which is going to be pretty necessary for our gardens wherever we're at. There is a little speculation on weed seed germination, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we always say that mulch helps with suppressing weed seeds, but there is some data to show that it could actually help speed the germination of specific weed seeds. So that's one of those things we'll talk about in a few more slides, to just kind of be cautious with that, because some say that those seeds can stay over from the compost, and some say because it's such a rich material that it can increase germination of weed seeds already there, like in this picture. But just be aware that that could go maybe either way depending on how we're composting. As far as the process, just being cognizant of the fact that there's multiple organisms in the soil. We usually speak to earthworms. That's the one that most are going to be familiar with, but you can see there the invertebrates and then our naturally occurring microorganisms that are there in the soil already. So other insects like millipedes, and then mites, snails, sow bugs. We see these little roly-polies and think they're bad, and in some situations they are, but in a soil situation or in a compost pile, they're actually good. They're helping break down all that waste material. And then again, bacteria and fungi, they're going to live naturally in the soil, and they're going to help with this process as well. And again, when these earthworms, when they're eating those food scraps, then again, they're releasing nitrogen into that soil, which is going to be very beneficial. So we see here that we just start out again in the kitchen with those basic food scraps, just what we refer to as those raw yard and garden food waste. We're going to make that available to all those microorganisms that we just saw on the previous slide. And then we're going to add oxygen. And when that occurs, that's when composting basically starts. So you can see here from this picture, the before and the after. Now it takes a little time. Some of us are not as patient as others. I'm one of those. I'm not very patient, so I try to do the little Speedy recipe that I'll give you toward the end. But we start out with this, and this is what we get. Much better than going into that landfill again. So in addition to creating heat that we talked about a little while ago, that composting is also going to produce water just from the scraps, and then of course being outside, carbon dioxide, and then you're going to get that dark crumbly looking mature compost. Be aware that mature compost is going to weigh about 700 to 1,200 pounds per cubic yard. Not that that number is of any great significance, but just be aware that the volume is going to shrink. So we're going to start out with a large pile of scraps. It's going to look really big, but it's going to really shrink. We're going to lose about 50 to 80% of that original volume that we start with. So be aware to facilitate composting on a large scale. It is going to require a little bit of time. But yeah, this is going to lose about 30 to 50% of its original weight. So again, managing the process, it's going to require time. under ideal conditions and frequent turning, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but that's usually going to have to happen about every 3 to 5 days, depending on Mother Nature. But you can usually finish composting a pile in about 4 weeks. But that's going to range out. I mean, we can extend that out even as long as 18 months, depending on the size and scope of the compost pile that we've created. So what we're going to spend a few minutes talking about next are factors that are going to affect that composting process. And these are some of those things you need to just be aware of that are going to be most critical, some of those things that I was talking about that is going to bind us all together. If we're not practicing some of those, we can get into some issues. So number one, odors. Sometimes we're going to smell that rotten egg smell, and we don't want that, right? But the reason that occurs often is because we're not turning that pile enough. You know, the big issue here is that we can't just pile stuff in a pile outside or in a bin and just leave it alone. We're going to have to go out there and turn it pretty frequently, because that's just helping mix those materials, because as you're going to see here in a few minutes, we're going to have different materials on that pile and we're going to have to mix them together. If we have oxygen that's being limited, that's when that decaying odor is going to arise. So that's when we're going to get that sulfur dioxide gas. We may even have a little bit of methane produced. But we can solve that problem. And we'll talk more about that here in just a few minutes. But ultimately what all this is leading to is having this carbon and nitrogen. We've got to have both. We can't have one without the other. And what does that mean? This is where folks get confused or get frustrated. But organic waste is what's going to furnish all those microorganisms with carbon and nitrogen. And it's a two-way street, if you will. We've got to have browns and greens added to our compost pile to really get the process moving. So when we talk about composting, we talk about this C to N ratio, or this carbon to nitrogen ratio. And you see there on that second bullet, near a ratio near 30 to 1 is what we consider optimal. Well, how in the world do you even know what that is? You know, I mean, it's too much science, it's too much math. I don't want to take the time to do all that. But I promise as we move through the next few slides, just hang with me, you're going to see that it does indeed get easier. The 31 is a good standard because, again, we've got carbon and we have nitrogen. And these are the two elements that we're going to be working with consistently when we're composting. So when we get a lower ratio than that, then that's when composting is going to slow down. But then conversely, when we get a large population of microorganisms that are going to be consuming high nitrogen materials, like those worm castings we've been talking about, then that's when we're going to get a stagnant pile. But again, we can work around these things. It's just making you aware that these issues can occur, but don't walk away from the compost pile. We can solve them pretty easy. So if your compost pile looks too wet, if it smells, add more brown items. And we're going to talk about what those brown items versus the green items are here in just a few minutes. But we're going to add more brown items and we're going to aerate, which means we're going to be pitching that, stirring that pile a little bit more. If you see that that pile looks extremely brown or dry, then we're going to add green material to that pile, and that's going to help us keep that pile moist and keep it from getting too stagnant. So again, we were talking about carbon to nitrogen, so what is that again? So greens and browns. Greens are going to be like those raw food waste that we've been talking about, or grass clippings. Be careful with your grass clippings. If you're utilizing herbicide, you might want to err on the side of caution and not throw that in your compost pile, but take your grass clippings and recycle those. Your browns are going to be any kind of leaves or sawdust, wood chips, and pine bark, and you can mix those two for the most optimum results. You want to also sprinkle water on the pile, so that's why we say when you place your pile outside to make sure you do have availability to water, because you don't want to go out there and dump buckets on it, because that's going to make it too wet. Have some kind of system where you can actually sprinkle if we don't get adequate rainfall, because we don't want to be able to squeeze water out of a compost pile, but when you squeeze it really hard, maybe 1 drop, maybe 2 drops are going to come from your hand. So we want it to be like a damp sponge, like the consistency of a damp sponge. If you add too much water, then that's when we can get into microorganisms getting a little unhappy, and actually we could waterlog them and drown them. So even though they're going to be able to reside in those moist conditions, if we get it too wet, we're going to lose our feeders. So be careful with that. One way you can be sure about your pile is to make sure that it's always warm, and that no matter how big your pile is, reaching your hand into the middle of that pile, if it's warm, then that's a good sign. We don't want it really hot, and we definitely don't want it cold. But if it's warm to the touch, then everybody's working together to do their thing, and composting is happening. So what are some of these greens that I'm talking about? And you'll see that the ratio is listed there. And the common thread you're going to notice, remember 30-to-1 is where we want to be for optimum. I don't worry too much about that. I don't get hung up on that ratio, because when we get toward the end of the presentation, you're going to see how to layer these in browns versus greens. So that number's not going to be very, I'm not going to say it's not relevant, because it is, but you're going to see how these two go together. So again, these are going to be what we're taking out of our house. Those coffee grounds, eggshells, fruit and veggie waste. That should actually be horse manure and not hose manure. So I'll try to get that changed before I put that into the Google Drive. Sorry about that. But any of our manures, even rabbits, I don't have that listed here, but if you have rabbits as pets at home, you can also utilize that. But these are all the things that are going to be considered green. And while we're on this slide and we're talking about adding things to the pile, again, one thing that I would invest in when we get to this scale is a thermometer, because even though we're going to reach our hand in there and determine that that's warm, we want to be able to know that that pile is between 130 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And if we're out there constantly stirring that pile again like we should be, then basically that's helping us from, again, mask that odor, and it's helping us keep those critters fed that are helping us decompose and make compost. So that would be two things I would definitely invest in. Is a fork to flip it with, because it works better than a shovel, and then a thermometer to just know what your temperature is going to be. All right, so as far as the C to N ratio of browns, or that carbon to nitrogen ratio, you can see those listed here. Bark, paper, even white paper, regular paper that we run through the printer, you can utilize that. But the key to this slide is going to be making sure we can get that as fine, broke down and chipped down or shredded down as much as we can, because our decomposers are going to be able to more efficiently manage that than they would great big branches off of out of the maple tree from the storm last night. Or if we take paper, if we take a whole ream of paper and just throw out on that pile, it's going to take forever to bust that down. So if you have paper, run it through the shredder and add that to the pile. Let's see, the one thing I would caution, be careful with black walnut, because we do have that issue with the juglans. It can be toxic, especially to tomatoes and some of those solanaceous plants. So if you're getting sawdust or any, mulch or anything like that from a neighbor down the road, a farmer friend that's clearing land, just make sure that it's not black walnut if this is going to be something you're adding to your garden beds. Okay, the next factor is water. We want that compost pile to contain about 40 to 60% water by weight. And again, this is where everybody, it's like, well, how can we possibly know that? And again, you're going to see here in a few minutes, hopefully all this is going to come together. But all those decomposers, or those living organisms, are going to require a little bit of water. Now, again, if we put too much, we're going to drown them out. If we don't have enough, then that's when we're going to, it's going to completely slow that pile down, and it's going to take forever. The other thing, if we get too much, that's when we're going to speed that rate of nutrient leaching, and we're going to reduce our volume of air coming into that pile as well. Again, that compost pile should feel damp, not saturated. I'm going to repeat some of these things because it's really key points to make sure that we're aware of, because most of these type issues are where the failure in a compost pile is going to lie. So again, I think I already said that, make sure it just yields 1 to 2 drops of liquid. Now, some of these words are really big, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I just wanted you to know that there are 3 phases to decomposition, and those are here for your reference. But you'll see how we start out. It's about 2 to 3 days. That temperature is going to be holding steady, hovering a little bit over 100 degrees. And then we're moving into the second phase, rising a little bit in temperature, and that's when a lot of that decomp is taking place. And then when we get to that last step is where we're stabilizing that compost pile. And now we have a thriving ecosystem within that pile that's contributing to the breakdown and also to the nutrition of that pile. Surface area, I think I've already mentioned this, making sure that we shred or clip large pieces. That's just going to help us get more surface area. It's going to help speed that process along. Again, microorganisms are going to work a lot faster if those pieces are going to be smaller. If you have grass clippings, or if you're raking leaves in the fall and it's rained on them and you know how it gets kind of clumpy or matted together, try to break that up before you throw that into the compost pile, or try to let them dry first. That's just going to give a little bit more surface area. If it mats it down, it can mat down places in your compost pile. And this will be included in the Google Drive too, just another schematic to show you how to add the browns and the greens. And it's like I said earlier, there's not one right or wrong way to do these piles. It's going to be, well, I mean, just whatever you're eating and using at home and what materials you have. You know, again, I have maple trees all throughout my yard, so I have a lot of maple leaves and a lot of maple branches that fall out of my tree that I'm adding to my compost pile. Others may have oak trees or evergreens. You know, we're all going to be a little bit different in what we're adding to the pile. Just be aware that when you are deadheading in the garden, or you've got disease in the garden, you know, we like to say that these compost piles can heat up enough to kill a lot of those pathogens. But we've seen from data that that's not always going to be true. We can still harbor some harmful plant and animal pathogens in there. So if you have diseased plants, say early blight on your tomatoes or bacterial wilt on your cucumbers, don't chunk those in there. What can happen if we don't get it heated up enough, or if it gets on the outskirts, we can still provide a sanctuary for some of those things to overwinter and still have a problem, or maybe even a larger problem the next year. So burn those materials, bag those, get rid of them. I wouldn't add those to the compost pile. And then just a few others here not to add. Anything that's fatty, or any type of bones, fish scraps, any kind of meat, milk, salad dressings, oil, any of those type things. The reason for that is that you're going to draw critters in. Many of you, if you fertilize with bone meal or blood meal, you may have the local dogs coming by and digging some of that up, or raccoons come at night, especially with fish scraps. So just don't add those to the compost pile. And then if you have cats, try to deter them if you can from using that as a litter box. Don't add your litter box to a compost pile. And then you see magazines is listed there. And this goes with newspapers too, because we'll add newspapers to a compost pile. But if we get those really nice, colorful sale ads, don't add those. It takes longer for those to break down. And plus the dye in those ads, we don't know where that's coming from. Same thing with the magazines. And here's another one. If you grow a lot of onion or garlic, some folks don't realize this, but don't add those clippings or any of that residue to your compost pile, because they can repel earthworms, and we really got to have earthworms. They're going to be really vital to our garden and our composting. So stay away from the allium family, adding those to your pile. Here's some more items that you can add. We've talked about a lot of these. Peanut hulls. If you're in coastal states that you have a lot of peanuts, be careful. Most of those varieties now have resistance to southern blight built in, but southern blight doesn't just affect tomatoes or peanuts, it affects potatoes as well. So we can carry that from one to the other. So Stay away from the peanuts. Pine needles, if you're adding those, just be aware that they're going to be more acidic, just like oak leaves. Again, that is just going to depend on, you know, what you're utilizing that compost for, where it's going, if that's going to make a difference. Like if you're growing blueberries, that would be a great addition to that. Okay, as far as building the pile, you'll see here a minimum of 3 by 3 and a maximum of 5 by 5. And the reason for that is to not get it too big to where it's just not going to break down, but we don't want to have it too small to where we don't have enough oxygen in there and we're not inviting the decomposers to come and actually stay. So this, again, if you're just getting started with a larger compost pile, again, I would invest in some kind of thermometer to kind of be able to read where we're at, especially in the center of that pile. Again, just a refresher there, making sure that we're turning that pile consistently is going to be imperative. We want it to be well drained. We don't want it just sitting in a swale or in a hole in the yard. We want to make sure that water is going to drain off, because otherwise that's where we're going to get into some issues with that smell. Direct sunlight, we don't want it in the shade, because we're not going to have enough light to keep that dry, to keep it turned. We want to shelter it from the wind, because we don't want the wind drying it out. So be careful with that as well. And here's just a picture of one that we've used wire caging to create that with, and this is a good depiction of those greens versus browns, how we've layered those materials in there. This is going to, again, somewhere about 150 degrees is where we want that temperature to be warm. And again, as this breaks down, it's going to continue to shrink, and you're going to be able to keep adding to that pile. Kind of see what that's going to look like over time. Some gardeners will also take the finished compost and use it for a compost tea. And that's just allowing that fully formed compost to steep in water for several days, and then you strain that off and use it as a homemade liquid fertilizer, as a starter fertilizer. But you'd want to wait till it's fully composted before you do that. And again, just a few other schematics. That was a little blurry, sorry about that, but just a few other schematics in here to kind of show you how that's going to be layered. And that's why I don't speak a lot about the carbon to nitrogen ratio. I typically will refer to it green versus brown, because that's what we're doing, is carbon and nitrogen. Just making sure we're getting those layered in there, making sure we sprinkle with a little water, we add a little garden soil to invite those microbes in and really get things moving, and then making sure we're stirring it. One way that you can tell that compost pile is done is when it's not giving off heat anymore. And it's going to, again, have that really nice brown, firm, crumbly texture. Just make sure that in excessive rainy periods, we just heard Pam talking at the beginning of the class that she got a couple inches over the weekend. But when we get that additional moisture, which is out of our control, then that's going to disrupt that moisture balance with the oxygen balance. So some folks will actually purchase what we call a compost blanket or a compost screen, and I did not put a picture of that in here, but there is a resource for a couple of those in the Google Drive. But maybe purchase one of those. I started to say Google blanket, good Lord, a compost blanket, and that's gonna help keep that air movement steady, and that way we're not covering that pile with plastic, because when we cover anything with plastic, that's doing what? That's restricting that airflow completely, and that's what we want to get away from. And again, just showing you some more pictures of what some of these different piles or bins are going to look like. They don't have to be pretty. Some people will address their landscaping and actually create some pretty cool compost bins that actually flow with their landscape. But again, the key for these is just to keep layering those brown materials with the green materials with a little bit of soil. And again, that's going to help those decomposers get to work, and it's going to help us prevent those odors from forming. We'll often get asked, well, what do I do if I'm just getting ready to build one of these? What do I do with all this stuff before I'm ready to go to the pile or to the bin? You can get one of those indoor composters, and I'll show you what some of those look like if you've just got garden scraps and things like that. And if you're picking up branches and stuff, before I get ready to create my compost, I'll just throw them all in a big pile and then move them when I get ready to start creating. But if you are doing this on a consistent basis, then you're going to be continually adding that to the pile anyway. But just to get started, you can just keep those items separate, keep them in bags or containers until you've got enough to make your layers. And there again, you can see it's just 3 pallets that have been nailed together, leaned together, and you can see how they've been forking that and turning it. Another thing I would caution too is when we're adding things to the compost pile, if we have some stragglers come up from seed, because seeds can survive that heat process, you might want to purge those. Don't necessarily go into the compost pile and maybe move those to the garden. They don't always do as well, and sometimes those seeds might not even be true to form, especially if they're a vining crop, a cucurbit, a squash, cucumber, pumpkin crop like that. So when we're looking at a pile like this, it's usually going to take about 3 to 4 months for that material to break down to get us to this point. Again, it's going to vary pretty dramatically depending on where we're at and how Mother Nature is treating us. But as long as we continually are turning, then we're gonna have compost, that material that's going to start looking like this. We want to continually create those air spaces in there, because that's what's going to provide the microorganisms again with that necessary oxygen. We cannot cut the oxygen off from these. So in this, you're going to have the basic recipe and you're going to have the Speedy recipe, and you see there it says 12 to 18 months. You can get by with faster than that. And this is utilizing one of those bins or pins that we've been looking at. And again, it's just taking what we've got at home. You're not going to need to purchase anything to get this going. For some of you, if you've got larger families, you're going to have a lot more food waste and scraps than maybe a single individual. But again, that's just going to vary. Keep adding to the pile. Make sure again that we got it on sloping soil. We don't want it sitting in water. And making sure we're taking those pieces and breaking them down, because again, that's going to be easier on those microorganisms to chew. And you'll notice here I put this one in here because it is 4-sided rather than the 3-sided. Probably one of the best benefits here is to be able to have that thermometer to stick down into the center of that pile from the side or even from the top. I don't know if this one has a mechanism to be able to go through on the bottom. This is not one of mine, so I'm not sure, but having that access toward at the ground level is going to be easy, as you can take that compost out the bottom as it continues to break down. But the other reason I like this is because you can see the flowers. I was talking about deadheading and everything a little while ago. So that's going to be fine. If you've got healthy plants, flowers that you're chunking in there, that's a-okay. I'm not sure what this right here is, but I noticed what looks like a fungal pathogen, those brown spots. I mean, it kind of looks like seed or apple rust. I don't know, but that's what I was talking about earlier, is just making sure we're not throwing any kind of disease material into that pile. When you're going to add compost to your garden soil or where you're going to plant turf seed, you want to mix about 1 to 2 inches of that compost in the top 6 to 8 inches of your topsoil. So same way with raised beds or containers. If you're doing that, just making sure that we're incorporating all that into a nice smooth layer. Some people will plant directly into compost, and there's a lot of nutrition there. I'm a firm believer you got to have a little soil mixed in there too, just because we're keeping that steady cycle going. So compost, you can add that to your potting and germination mixtures in the springtime as well. You can use that actually as a substitute for peat moss. If you're planting blueberries, you can utilize that in your furrows at planting and your holes at planting for blueberries, because it's what I refer to as fluff. You want to give those roots room to move out. If you do use compost in your germination mix, you need to allow that to sit for a couple of more months. That's just so those microorganisms that could potentially attack seedling roots leave that pile, or they die off. So we want to be careful with that, because they can be very you know, excellent in our compost pile, but if we're trying to get some seed started, some of those can nibble on those roots and cause us an issue. So if you're doing that, just give it a couple of extra months. This is, I'm trying to remember why I put this one in here. I think it was just showing you that we've got a compost pile started, but we're just continually adding whatever to the top of that mix. And it's, you know, after he adds this green, because this is our greens, this is where we're getting the carbon, then he's going to come back with that layer of browns, right? And we're just going to keep layering that and keep turning. And it's just going to be an ongoing process. You can kind of see that from here too. So anything goes, you know, again, there's no right or wrong way to utilize compost or even creating it. It's just knowing that there can be some issues there with water, with aeration, making sure we get some, you know, the right ratio of these greens to browns. And again, you know, when we talk about utilizing it as a mulch, we'll say to use at a thickness of about 1 to 2 inches. And we say again that mulch can suppress those weed seeds, and it helps us conserve water and all that. But we have again had some scientific data show us that it can encourage the growth of those weed seeds. So I say that to you just to be cautious. Some folks, and we're talking about that next Monday, you know, again, there's in our own personal situations, you know, what I deem a weed, it may not be what y'all deem a weed, and vice versa. So it's just going to depend on what your weed pressure is, what you can tolerate, and what you can't, basically. So just keep that in mind in the back of your head as you're starting your compost pile. If you're wanting to speed up your compost pile, some folks will use a PVC pipe and about a 4-inch diameter, and they'll actually drill holes into that and stick it into the middle of that pile. And what that's going to do is help add moisture and create airflow a little bit more throughout that pile. So I should have put a picture of that in here, but you would just go down through the center of that pile with that. Make sure you get the holes in there, and that's going to increase the aeration. And again, just a lot of pictures in here for y'all to go back and refer to how we're layering. Brown layer, green layer, brown layer, green layer. As long as we're doing that and alternating, and you'll see there on the bottom we've got sticks, 4 to 6 inches in the bottom of that. And we just alternate. And again, greens are going to be what we're taking out of the house. Any grass clippings, any kind of deadheading, pruning, as long as we don't have diseased tissue in there. This is a video that you can watch later. The link will be live once you get into the Google Drive. I put this picture in here just to show you, if you are in ground or if you have a raised bed or using multiple raised beds, turn that into a compost pile in the fall and the winter. And this is, again, cover crops and soil. That's another one of my big passions, and we're going to have a class on that in August, so y'all come back and see me, or September. But if we plant a cover crop, we never want to, first of all, leave that ground fallow or bare. We always want to have a cover on it, even in the wintertime. So if we go in and put a cover crop on that, no matter what we're doing, that's going to give us food, nutrition, the next spring when we till that under or fork it under in a raised bed. That's going to start that natural composting process in our garden anyway, the decomposition process. But if we're raking leaves and we have all that, even after we get a cover crop, which this one doesn't have a cover crop coming through, but I just take all my leaves and chunk them on my garden after my cover crops come up. And I do the same with my food waste. I've just got to where I devote one area of my garden just to doing that throughout the winter months. Now again, your compost pile is going to go dormant, but as things start heating up in the springtime, then that's when those microbes are going to go back to work. So I'll usually do that in my garden. So if you don't want to go to the bother of creating a bin, and you're going to utilize that in an in-ground setting or in that particular raised bed to help build that soil till, then that's one easy way you can get by with doing that. I don't add a lot of big material to that edge of my garden. It'll just be the really small stuff that's going to break down pretty quick. but make sure you utilize that space. If you're just getting started and we need a mechanism of containing those in the kitchen or on the porch, in the basement, whatever, you can see here we can get really classy. There's many different indoor kitchen composters that we can use to store that, or we can create our own. Just take a 5-gallon bucket, make sure that we're drilling holes. You'll see the common theme here on both of these, whether we're purchasing one or we're creating our own, we've got those vent holes. So that's going to be necessary too. We don't want that stuff to just rot in there. So just store it where it's going to be easily accessible. Make it fit with your decor, whatever. Just remember that air is going to be critical. Some folks will even take a piece of nylon mesh and put over that too if you're keeping it in the house, because fruit flies can be an issue. So you can do that too to keep those out. But then as that composts down, or you get ready to start your pile, you can just go throw that into your pile or in your bin. Now we went over the basic recipe, and then this is the Speedy recipe. Like I say, you can get by in about 4 to 6 weeks if we've got ideal conditions that you can have compost ready on a little bit smaller scale. So the same principles are going to apply just like in the basic recipe. We want that pile in full sun, gently sloping soil, but this is where we really want to make sure on this last point that we're, just like I said, in my own garden, I'm not putting big old branches that fall out of my trees. I'm making sure that I'm putting really small shredded stuff in that pile, because it's going to be easier to break down. It's going to go break down, decompose a lot faster. But again, same principle applies. We're just going to keep adding those layers, but you'll notice there we're going to increase that nitrogen level by adding more manure. Now some of you may be doing that automatically, but if those of you are not doing that and we're just letting it do it on its own time, if you can find some kind of manure that's going to add that nitrogen, it's going to pick that up. Some folks will even add urea, store-bought urea, to speed that process up. You can do that as well. But just keep layering that and turn it every 2 to 5 days, just making sure that you maintain that moisture. And if you're OCD like I am on those type things, you can also purchase one of those moisture, not moisture thermometers, moisture checkers. My mind just went blank. But that'll tell you what that moisture level is going to be. And they're usually going to have a really long bulb on it to where you can stick it. You know, it's not going to be like a normal thermometer or moisture tester. It'll actually allow you to be able to get further into that compost pile. And you'll notice sawdust is going to be your friend if you're really wanting to speed things up, even more so than wood chips, because again, it's that surface area. And even ammonium nitrate. I think I said urea a minute ago, but I think more folks are using urea now because it's a little bit more accessible than ammonium nitrate. But either one of those would do. All right, so that was a pretty speedy introduction, I guess, to basic composting, but I hope you feel a little bit more comfortable with it and just maybe realize I wish we were in person and I could see more than just like 6 of you, because I would ask how many of you have a compost bin or how many of you are just getting started with one. But hopefully this gives you some tips on how to be able to go out there and layer those greens and browns. And again, don't let that intimidate you, because even me, before I really got mine going, I was like, well, I can't remember all these C/N ratios, and you know, I have an ag degree and I'm going, now what, see, carbon, nitrogen, okay, it's 30, how do I know what that is? And you know, I'm trying to utilize my cheat sheet, and I was making it way more complicated than it needed to be. But you know, the basic principle is just being able to layer those greens, layer those browns, don't put anything bad in there, you know, keep the bad stuff out, keep turning it, invest in that thermometer, check your temperature, get used to what the feel of that compost pile on the inside is going to feel like, so you'll kind of know. Your nose is going to tell you a lot of times too if there's an issue, but again, those are problems that are going to be really easy to solve with just a little bit of water, a little bit of adding greens or maybe browns, depending on what the situation is. But once we get the environment for those microbes and those microorganisms into our pile, then, you know, it's going to be an ongoing process that we're going to be able to keep those, and we're providing, you know, great nutrition to our gardens and our landscape bed, or even our lawns, you know, wherever we're utilizing that. Okay, so I know I saw that chat box blinking there a few minutes ago, so I'm going to pull that up and I'm going to go through some of that, but I don't want to keep everybody on here. But what I will do is save this chat too, because maybe some of you have put in some of your own comments, maybe some of the things that you're doing. So I will go through that tonight and get it into a readable form, and I'll also put that into the Google Drive.